The screaming started at dawn. Margaret Thornfield pressed herself against the splintered cabin door, her wedding dress torn and mud-stained as something massive crashed through the vegetable garden outside. Through the cracked window, she glimpsed a nightmare that made her question her sanity. Dozens of enormous wild boars, their tusks gleaming white as bone, systematically destroying everything her intended husband had built. The train from Philadelphia had delivered her to Cedar Ridge, Oregon, just 12 hours ago. She was supposed to be preparing for her wedding breakfast, not barricading herself inside a ransacked cabin, while prehistoric-looking beasts turned her new life into a wasteland. But Margaret Thornfield had not traveled 2,000 miles to surrender to four-legged demons, no matter how large their tusks or how terrifying their squeals. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 24 hours earlier, Margaret had stepped off the Oregon and California Railroad with her heart full of hope and her carpet bag containing everything she valued in the world. The journey from Philadelphia had taken 6 grueling days, but every mile had carried her closer to what she believed would be salvation from the suffocating constraints of Eastern society. At 26, Margaret was considered a spinster by Philadelphia's rigid social standards. The daughter of a deceased university professor, she possessed an education that made her unsuitable for domestic servitude and a sharp tongue that made her unmarriageable to the kind of men her social circle deemed appropriate. Her father's death had left her with debts that consumed his modest estate, and her only living relative, a cold aunt who disapproved of everything Margaret represented, had made it clear that charity would come with conditions Margaret found unacceptable. The matrimonial advertisement in the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin had appeared like divine intervention. Established Oregon rancher seeks educated wife. Comfortable home, growing property, partnership in building something meaningful, serious inquiries only from ladies of character and ambition. Thomas Hartwell's letters had painted a picture of opportunity that beckoned like sunrise after a long night. He described Cedar Ridge as a growing community nestled in Oregon's fertile Cascade foothills, where apple orchards and wheat fields stretched towards snow-capped mountains. His homestead, he wrote, encompassed 320 acres of prime land, with a sturdy cabin, established gardens and livestock that provided both income and security. Most appealingly, Thomas had seemed to value Margaret's intelligence rather than merely tolerating it. His correspondence revealed a man who had attended normal school, read extensively, and believed that frontier life offered opportunities for women that Eastern society would never permit. Out here, he had written, a woman's capabilities matter more than her compliance with social expectations. Margaret had arrived in Cedar Ridge filled with anticipation, only to find Thomas Hartwell waiting at the depot with an expression of barely concealed panic rather than joy. He was a tall man, with premature grey streaking his brown hair and the weathered hands of someone who worked outdoors, but his eyes held a desperation that immediately set Margaret on edge. "Miss Thornfield," he had said, gripping his hat with white knuckles, "I need to explain the situation before we proceed to the homestead." Margaret had felt her stomach drop even before he continued. In her experience, men who needed to explain situations were usually about to reveal that reality, bore little resemblance to their promises. "There's been some trouble with wildlife," Thomas had continued as he loaded her trunk onto his wagon. "Wild boars have moved down from the mountains. They've been problematic for several homesteaders in the area." Margaret studied his face, noting the careful way he chose his words. Problematic how, exactly? Thomas had avoided her direct gaze as he secured her luggage. "They've damaged some crops, scattered livestock, that sort of thing. Nothing we can't handle, but I wanted you to be aware." The 20-minute ride to the Hartwell homestead had taken them through countryside that should have been breathtakingly beautiful. Rolling hills covered with native grasses gave way to stands of Douglas fir and oak, while distant mountains provided a majestic backdrop that made Margaret understand why people spoke of Oregon as paradise. But even during that initial journey, Margaret noticed troubling signs. Fences along the road showed evidence of significant damage, posts knocked askew, rails splintered, gates hanging from broken hinges. Several farmhouses they passed appeared abandoned, with boarded windows and overgrown yards that suggested hasty departures. "How long has this wildlife problem been going on?" Margaret asked, as they passed a particularly devastated orchard where apple trees had been stripped of bark and fruit. "Few months," Thomas replied tersely. "Started in late spring, when the snow melted early in the high country, drove the Boars down looking for food." Margaret absorbed this information with growing unease. Thomas's letters had been written throughout the summer, yet he had never mentioned wildlife problems that were clearly severe enough to drive families from their homes. The Hartwell homestead, when they finally reached it, bore evidence of Thomas's attempt to prepare for her arrival despite the circumstances. The cabin had been freshly whitewashed, flower boxes installed beneath the windows, and a vegetable garden planted with obvious care. Margaret could see that under normal circumstances it would have been exactly the kind of comfortable, modest home she had envisioned, but nothing about the circumstances appeared normal. The entire property was surrounded by a hastily constructed fence of sharpened posts that looked more like fortification than decoration. Deep gouges in the earth around the cabin spoke of recent disturbances, and Margaret noticed that every window had been fitted with heavy wooden shutters that could be barred from inside. "It's lovely, Thomas," Margaret said carefully, not wanting to hurt his feelings, while also not pretending she didn't notice the obvious signs of trouble. "You've clearly put considerable effort into making it welcoming." Thomas's relief was palpable. "I know it's not what you might have expected from a more settled area, but we're building something here, Margaret. In 5 years, 10 at the most, this whole region will be developed farmland. The railroad's bringing more settlers every month, and the territorial government is offering incentives for agricultural development." Margaret nodded, recognizing the enthusiasm of someone trying to convince himself as much as his listener. She had heard similar speeches from men back east who were promoting various investment schemes that seemed too good to be true. "What exactly is your plan for dealing with the wild boar situation?" she asked directly. Thomas's expression grew, troubled. "Several of us have been hunting them, but they're smart animals. They avoid areas where they've encountered resistance and move to easier targets. The territorial authorities have been contacted, but they're dealing with similar problems." Throughout the region, Margaret studied the defensive preparations around the cabin with new understanding. Thomas Wasson Hartwell hadn't been preparing for her arrival as much as he had been preparing for siege. That evening, as they shared a dinner of venison stew and fresh bread, Thomas had attempted to restore the romantic atmosphere his letters had promised. He spoke of their future together, the improvements he planned for the homestead, and the children who would grow up in the paradise they were building together. Margaret found herself genuinely liking Thomas Hartwell. He was intelligent, hard-working, and clearly sincere in his desire to build a meaningful life with her. Under different circumstances, she might have felt the stirrings of real affection for this earnest man who valued her mind and treated her as an equal partner in their shared enterprise. But Margaret had also developed the ability to distinguish between what she hoped was true and what she could observe was actually happening. The evidence around the homestead suggested that Thomas was fighting a losing battle against forces beyond his control, and that his confidence in their future was based more on desperation than realistic assessment. As night fell, Thomas had shown Margaret to the cabin's single bedroom, which he had vacated for her use while he slept on a cot near the fireplace. The gesture was gentlemanly, but Margaret noticed that he positioned his rifle within easy reach and checked the window bars twice before settling down for the night. "Thomas," Margaret said quietly from the bedroom doorway, "how dangerous are these animals really?" Thomas looked up from where he was banking the fire. "They're large, and they can be aggressive when threatened or protecting their young. But mostly they're after food. As long as we don't corner them or get between them. And their escape route, they'll generally avoid human contact." Margaret wanted to believe him, but the fortifications around the cabin suggested Thomas was preparing for more than casual encounters with animals seeking food. She lay awake for hours that first night, listening to unfamiliar sounds outside. Rustling in the underbrush, distant grunting that might have been wind through the trees or something more ominous, and occasionally the sound of something large moving through the forest beyond the cabin. Margaret had faced difficult situations before. Her father's long illness had taught her about making hard decisions with limited resources. The financial crisis following his death had shown her that she was capable of more than she had originally believed. But this situation felt different, more primitive, more immediate, and potentially more dangerous than anything she had previously encountered. When she finally drifted off to sleep, Margaret's dreams were filled with scenarios where she had to choose between safety and the independence she had traveled so far to find. She woke to the sound of Thomas shouting her name and something massive crashing through the vegetable garden. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret jolted awake to Thomas's urgent voice cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. "Margaret, stay inside and bar the door." She stumbled from the bed, her nightgown catching on the rough wooden floor as crashes and squeals erupted from what sounded like every direction at once. Through the bedroom window, she glimpsed movement in the grey morning light. Dark shapes moving with purpose through Thomas's carefully tended property. The front door slammed shut, followed by the sound of the heavy wooden bar sliding into place. Thomas's boots pounded across the floor as he moved between windows, and Margaret heard the distinctive sound of his rifle being loaded. "What's happening?" she called, pulling on her wrapper and moving toward the main room. "Sounder of Boars," Thomas replied grimly, peering through a gap in the shutters. "Biggest group I've seen yet. Must be 30 or 40 of them." Margaret joined him at the window, pressing her eye to the narrow opening between the wooden slats. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. These weren't the domestic pigs she had occasionally seen on Pennsylvania farms, but massive, prehistoric-looking creatures with coarse black hair and curved tusks that gleamed like ivory daggers. The largest boar, clearly the leader, stood nearly 4 feet high at the shoulder and probably weighed close to 400 pounds. Its small, intelligent eyes surveyed the homestead with a calculating expression that was disturbingly human-like. Around it, dozens of smaller but equally formidable animals systematically destroyed everything Thomas had built. They weren't mindlessly rampaging. Margaret watched in fascination and horror as the boars worked with obvious coordination. Some uprooted the vegetable garden with surgical precision, consuming root vegetables while trampling plants they didn't want. Others knocked over water barrels and feed containers, accessing contents while creating maximum destruction. The largest members of the group focused on the outbuildings, using their tusks and massive bodies to test structural weak points. "They're intelligent," Margaret whispered, watching a pair of boars work together to overturn a chicken coop while a third waited to catch the escaping birds. "More than most people realize," Thomas confirmed, his voice tight with frustration. "They plan their raids, post sentries, and remember which properties offer the best opportunities. Once they've identified a target, they keep coming back until there's nothing left worth taking." Margaret absorbed this information with growing dread. She had expected to deal with dangerous animals, but these creatures displayed problem-solving abilities that made them far more threatening than simple beasts seeking food. A tremendous crash from the barn made both of them flinch. Through the window, they watched 3 large boars systematically destroy the structure Thomas used to shelter his horses and store grain. The animals had apparently figured out how to work the latch mechanism and were now methodically emptying the building. While reducing it to kindling, "Where are your horses?" Margaret asked, suddenly realizing she hadn't seen the animals Thomas had mentioned in his letters. Thomas's silence answered her question before he spoke. "Lost them 2 weeks ago. Boars spooked them during a night raid, broke through the corral. Benson scattered. I found what was left of them 3 days later." Margaret felt cold understanding wash over her. The Boars hadn't just damaged Thomas's property. They had systematically eliminated his means of transportation, his livestock, and his ability to generate income. He was trapped as effectively as if he were under military siege. "How long has this particular group been targeting your homestead?" she asked. "They've hit me 4 times in the past month," Thomas replied. "Each time, they've been more organized, more thorough. It's like they're learning from each raid, figuring out better ways to access what they want." Margaret studied the destruction unfolding outside with the analytical mind her father had trained her to use. The boars' behavior suggested they weren't simply hungry animals driven to desperation, but strategic thinkers capable of sustained campaigns against human settlements. "Have they attacked people directly?" she asked. Thomas hesitated before answering. "Jake Morrison, about 5 miles south of here, tried to defend his property with a shotgun. They found him 3 days later." Margaret's blood turned to ice. "They killed him, gored and trampled. His wife and children had already fled to town, so at least they weren't there when it happened." Thomas's voice carried the weight of a man who knew he might face the same fate. The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow. She hadn't traveled to Oregon to marry a struggling homesteader. She had walked into a war zone where the enemy was winning and her intended husband was likely to become a casualty. A new sound drew their attention back to the window. The lead. Boar was making a series of grunting calls that prompted immediate responses from the other animals. Within minutes, the entire sounder had organized itself into formation, with the largest animals forming a perimeter, while smaller ones continued their destructive work. "They're communicating," Margaret observed with fascination despite her fear. "Like a military unit," Thomas confirmed. "I've watched them coordinate attacks on multiple properties simultaneously. They'll hit 3 or 4 homesteads in the same night, keeping the settlers from helping each other." Margaret processed this information, recognizing that she was witnessing something far more complex than simple animal behavior. These boars had developed tactics that suggested not just intelligence, but cultural transmission of knowledge between generations. A sudden impact against the cabin wall made both of them jump. One of the larger boars was testing the structure, pushing against the logs with its massive shoulder, while using its tusks to probe for weak points in the chinking. "How strong is this cabin?" Margaret asked, trying to keep panic out of her voice. "Strong enough to keep them out if we don't give them reason to get more aggressive," Thomas replied, but Margaret could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Another boar joined the first, and together they began a systematic examination of the cabin's exterior. Margaret watched through the window as they tested each log, each joint, each potential entry point, with the thoroughness of professional saboteurs. "Thomas," she said quietly, "how exactly were you planning to deal with this situation after we were married?" Thomas finally looked directly at her, and Margaret saw the desperate hope in his eyes that she had been too focused on immediate danger to notice before. "I was hoping that with 2 of us, we could develop better strategies, maybe establish a contact with other survivors, coordinate some kind of defense." Margaret understood now why Thomas had been so eager to marry her despite never having met her in person. He wasn't just seeking a wife, he was seeking a partner in what might be a fight for survival against an enemy that had already defeated several of his neighbors. What happened to the other settlers you mentioned? The ones who were supposedly dealing with similar problems? Thomas's expression grew even more troubled. Most of them have pulled back to Cedar Ridge or moved on entirely. The Hendersons abandoned their place last week. The Millers left 2 weeks before that. There's maybe 6 or 7 families still trying to hold their homesteads, but we're scattered over too much territory to help each other effectively. Margaret absorbed this information with growing clarity about the true situation. Thomas Hartwell wasn't building a thriving homestead. He was making a last stand against forces that had already conquered most of the surrounding territory. The testing of the cabin walls continued for another hour, while Margaret and Thomas watched in tense silence. The Boars' behavior was methodical, almost scientific in its thoroughness. They were clearly capable of breaking into the cabin if they chose to make the effort, but seemed to be evaluating whether the potential rewards justified the energy expenditure. Finally, the lead boar made another series of calls, and the entire sounder began moving away from the cabin toward the forest. But Margaret noticed they weren't retreating. They were taking up positions that surrounded the homestead while remaining out of rifle range. They're not leaving, she observed. No, Thomas confirmed grimly. They're settling in for a siege. They've done this before at other properties. They'll wait us out, making it impossible for us to tend livestock, gather food, or maintain the property until we're forced to abandon it. Margaret looked around the cabin, taking inventory of their resources. Thomas had stockpiled some supplies, but not enough to sustain 2 people indefinitely. More critically, they had no means of communication with the outside world, and no way to call for help. How long can we hold out, she asked. Maybe 2 weeks if we're careful with food and water, Thomas replied. But that assumes they don't find a way to cut off our access to the well. Margaret studied the man she had traveled 2,000 miles to marry, seeing him clearly for the first time. Thomas Hartwell was brave, determined, and genuinely committed to building a life in Oregon, but he was also fighting a losing battle against an enemy he didn't fully understand. More importantly, Margaret realized that her own survival now depended on finding solutions that Thomas hadn't been able to develop. On his own, she had come west seeking independence and partnership, but the partnership she was being offered was essentially an invitation to share in Thomas's likely defeat. As the morning wore on and the Boars maintained their positions around the homestead, Margaret found herself thinking not about the romantic future she had envisioned, but about the immediate problem of staying alive long enough to have any future at all. The mail-order bride who had stepped off the train in Cedar Ridge was discovering that frontier life offered challenges she had never imagined, and that survival might require capabilities she wasn't sure she possessed. On the 3rd day of the siege, Margaret spotted the hunter. She had been maintaining watch at the eastern window when movement in the distant tree line caught her attention. Unlike the heavy, purposeful movement of the Boars, this was something altogether different, fluid, deliberate, and unmistakably human. The figure emerged briefly from behind a massive Douglas fir, just long enough for Margaret to make out a tall man in buckskin clothing carrying what appeared to be a rifle. Then he vanished back into the forest shadows as silently as he had appeared. "Thomas!" she called softly, not wanting to alert the Boars that still maintained their positions around the homestead. "There's someone in the woods to the east." Thomas joined her at the window, squinting through the narrow gap between the shutters. The Boars had learned to recognize the signs of human activity and would respond aggressively to any indication that their quarry might be attempting to escape or signal for help. "I don't see anyone," Thomas whispered after several minutes of careful observation. "He was there," Margaret insisted. "Tall man, dressed like a trapper or hunter. He seemed to be studying the situation." Thomas frowned, considering the implications. Could be Daniel Coltrane. He's got a cabin about 10 miles north of here, does some hunting and trapping, but I haven't seen him since the Boer troubles started. Margaret kept her eyes fixed on the spot where she had seen the figure, hoping for another glimpse. The Boers had maintained their siege with remarkable patience, rotating their positions to ensure the cabin remained constantly surrounded, while different members of the Sounder foraged for food in the surrounding forest. Their intelligence continued to astound and terrify her. The animals had quickly learned the range of Thomas's rifle and positioned themselves just beyond effective shooting distance. When one of them ventured closer to investigate something, others would move to maintain the perimeter. They posted sentries at elevated positions that provided clear views of all approaches to the cabin. Most unsettling of all, they seemed to understand human psychology. Whenever Margaret or Thomas appeared at a window, the nearest Boers would make direct eye contact and emit low, rumbling sounds that seemed designed to communicate threat rather than mere animal noise. "They know we're watching them," Margaret observed as a particularly large sow turned to stare directly at their window. "And they want us to know they're watching us," Thomas replied grimly. "It's psychological warfare. They're trying to break our nerve." Margaret had to admit the strategy was effective. After 3 days of constant vigilance, both she and Thomas were showing signs of strain. They slept in shifts, ate sparingly to conserve supplies, and spoke in whispers to avoid triggering aggressive responses from their besiegers. But the appearance of the mysterious hunter had given Margaret her first spark of hope since the siege began. If someone was moving freely through the forest, despite the Boer presence, it suggested that escape or rescue might be possible. That evening, as twilight settled over the homestead, Margaret caught another glimpse of the figure. This time, he was closer, near enough for her to make out more details of his appearance. He was indeed tall, probably in his 30s, with long dark hair and the weathered complexion of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. His clothing was practical frontier gear, but well-maintained and of good quality. Most significantly, he moved through the forest with a confidence that suggested he was neither afraid of the Boers nor surprised by their presence. This was someone who understood the enemy they were facing. "There," Margaret whispered urgently to Thomas, "near the big oak tree." This time, Thomas spotted the hunter immediately. "That's Daniel Coltrane, all right. But what's he doing out there? It's suicide to be moving around in the open with those Boers so active." As they watched, the hunter did something that made Margaret's breath catch. He deliberately stepped into a small clearing where the Boers could clearly see him, then stood motionless for several seconds. The nearest Boers turned to face him, but instead of charging or retreating, they simply observed him with what appeared to be mutual recognition. After this strange standoff, the hunter melted back into the forest, and the Boers resumed their normal patrol patterns around the cabin. "Did you see that?" Margaret asked in amazement. "They didn't attack him. It was almost like they were acknowledging each other." Thomas was staring at the spot where the hunter had disappeared with the expression of dawning comprehension. "Daniel's been hunting Boers since they first moved down from the mountains. Killed more of them than any other man in the county. Maybe they've learned to recognize him as a serious threat." Margaret considered this possibility, but something about the encounter bothered her. The interaction hadn't looked like predator and prey recognizing each other. It had looked more like a negotiation, or at least a mutual understanding of boundaries. "Or maybe," she said slowly, "he's learned something about dealing with them that the rest of us haven't figured out." That night, Margaret volunteered to take the first watch, while Thomas attempted to get some much-needed sleep. She positioned herself at the window that provided the best view of the area where the hunter had appeared, hoping he might return. Around midnight, her patience was rewarded. The hunter emerged from the forest again, this time carrying what appeared to be a large bundle. He moved with the same confident silence, but now he was clearly approaching the cabin with specific purpose. Margaret watched in fascination as he navigated between the boar sentries with movements that seemed choreographed to avoid detection. The animals were clearly aware of his presence. She could see ears swiveling to track his movement, but they made no move to intercept or challenge him. The hunter reached the rear wall of the cabin and pressed something against the logs near. The ground! Margaret realized he was leaving some kind of message or supply package. Then, as silently as he had arrived, he disappeared back into the darkness. Margaret waited until she was certain he was gone before waking Thomas. Together, they carefully opened the back door just far enough to retrieve what the hunter had left. It was a leather pouch containing dried meat, hardtack, and a note written in a bold masculine hand. Daniel Coltrane. Been watching the situation. Have planned to break siege. Signal with mirror in eastern window at dawn if you want help. Warning, my methods are not gentle. Margaret stared at the note, feeling a surge of excitement mixed with apprehension. The prospect of rescue was enormously appealing, but the hunter's warning suggested that his plan might involve considerable risk. "What do you think he has in mind?" she asked Thomas. Thomas studied the note with obvious concern. "Daniel's got a reputation for being thorough in his approach to problem-solving. When the territorial government put a bounty on wolves a few years back, he collected more pelts than any 3 other hunters combined." Margaret absorbed this information, recognizing that they were being offered help from someone who approached challenges with lethal efficiency. The question was whether they were desperate enough to accept assistance that might be as dangerous as the problem they were trying to solve. "How well do you know this Daniel Coltrane?" she asked. "Well enough to know he keeps his word and doesn't take unnecessary risks," Thomas replied. "If he says he has a plan, he's probably thought it through carefully. The question is whether we're ready to trust our lives to someone else's judgment." Margaret looked out at the Boars maintaining their patient siege, then at their dwindling supplies, then at Thomas's haggard face that reflected her own exhaustion. They were slowly losing a war of attrition against an enemy that could afford to wait indefinitely. "What choice do we have?" she asked quietly. Thomas nodded slowly. "None that I can see. But Margaret, you need to understand. Once we signal for Daniel's help, we're committed to whatever he has planned. There won't be any changing our minds or backing out." Margaret thought about the life she had left in Philadelphia, the careful plans she had made for a secure future with Thomas, and the romantic dreams that had brought her west. All of that seemed impossibly naive now, swept away by the harsh realities of frontier survival. But she also thought about the intelligence she had seen in the Boars' coordinated attacks, the systematic way they had eliminated Thomas's neighbors, and the patient efficiency with which they were destroying any possibility of human settlement in the region. "We signal him at dawn," she decided. As they settled in to wait for daylight, Margaret found herself wondering what kind of man could move freely through forest dominated by creatures that had driven everyone else to flight or death. Daniel Coltrane was clearly more than just another frontier hunter. He was someone who had found a way to operate successfully in an environment where others had failed. The question was whether his success came from superior knowledge, superior skill, or methods that Thomas might find morally questionable. Margaret was beginning to understand that survival on the frontier sometimes required choices that civilized society would never approve. As dawn approached and she prepared to signal for help from a man she had never met, Margaret realized she was about to discover just how much she was willing to sacrifice for the chance to live. At dawn, Margaret positioned Thomas's shaving mirror at the eastern window and caught the first rays of sunlight, sending flashes toward the tree line where Daniel Coltrane had appeared. 3 quick flashes, pause, 3 more, a signal she hoped would convey their acceptance of his offer. The response came within minutes, a brief reflection from deep within the forest, followed by what appeared to be a piece of white cloth tied to a branch that hadn't been there the night before. Then nothing. "Now what?" Thomas asked, settling beside her with 2 cups of coffee made from their carefully rationed supplies. "Now we wait and see what kind of man we've invited into our lives," Margaret replied, studying the forest with new intensity. They didn't have to wait long. By mid-morning, the boar's behavior began to change in subtle ways that Margaret's analytical mind immediately noticed. The animals were becoming agitated, their usual disciplined positions shifting as individuals broke formation to investigate scents or sounds that she and Thomas couldn't detect. The lead boar, the massive male that had orchestrated the siege with such military precision, was pacing restlessly along the northern perimeter. Its small, intelligent eyes kept darting toward the forest, and it was making low, rumbling vocalizations that prompted nervous responses from the other animals. "Something's got them spooked," Thomas observed. Margaret watched the animals' behavior with growing fascination. Whatever Daniel Coltrane was doing, it was clearly having a psychological effect on creatures that had previously displayed absolute confidence in their control of the situation. Around noon, the first of Daniel's strategies became apparent. A series of sharp cracks echoed from the forest, not gunshots, but the sound of large branches breaking under considerable weight. The boars immediately turned toward the sounds, their formation tightening as they prepared to investigate a potential threat. But the sounds moved in a pattern that made no tactical sense, circling the homestead at a distance while never approaching, close enough for the boars to mount an effective response. Margaret realized that Daniel was deliberately creating noise to keep the animals off balance, forcing them to maintain constant alertness without giving them a clear target for their aggression. "He's wearing them down," she murmured with admiration. The psychological warfare continued throughout the afternoon. Strange scents began drifting from the forest, acrid smokes that made the boars snort and shake their heads, unfamiliar animal odors that triggered instinctive alarm responses, and occasionally the unmistakable smell of cooking meat that seemed designed to remind the animals that they were potential prey as well as predators. By evening, the boars' disciplined siege formation had deteriorated into nervous clusters of animals that startled at every sound and shadow. The lead boar was making increasingly agitated calls that sounded more like requests for information than commands to subordinates. "Whatever he's doing, it's working," Thomas said with grudging admiration. "Those animals have gone from confident predators to nervous prey in less than 12 hours. Margaret was beginning to understand that Daniel Coltrane possessed knowledge about boar behavior that went far beyond simple hunting skills. He was manipulating their instincts, exploiting their psychology, and turning their own intelligence against them. As darkness fell, the real demonstration of Daniel's capabilities began. The first boar simply vanished. Margaret was maintaining watch at the western window when she noticed that one of the sentries that had been positioned near a fallen log was no longer there. The animal hadn't moved away. It had simply disappeared, as if it had never existed. "Thomas," she whispered urgently, "count the boars on the western side." Thomas joined her at the window and began a careful inventory of the animals visible in the moonlight. "I count 11. There should be 13. Even as they watched, another boar seemed to melt into the shadows near the barn ruins. One moment, it was clearly visible in the moonlight. The next, it was gone without a sound or sign of struggle. The remaining boars were becoming increasingly agitated as they apparently realized that members of their group were disappearing. The lead boar was moving frantically between positions, using vocalizations that sounded almost like roll calls as it attempted to account for its diminished forces. "How is he doing that?" Thomas asked in amazement. Margaret had no answer, but she was beginning to develop a healthy respect for Daniel Coltrane's abilities. Whatever methods he was using, they were so silent and efficient that even the Boars' acute senses couldn't detect the threat until it was too late. By midnight, the siege was effectively broken. Only a handful of Boars remained, and these were clearly demoralized animals that had lost confidence in their ability to control the situation. The lead Boar was making distressed calls that received fewer and fewer responses as the night progressed. Around 2 in the morning, Margaret heard a soft tapping at the cabin's rear door, a rhythmic pattern that sounded like a prearranged signal. Thomas approached the door cautiously, rifle ready, and called out in a low voice. "Daniel, it's me," came the reply in a deep, quiet voice. "Safe to open up, but stay alert. Got a few more animals to deal with before dawn." Thomas lifted the heavy bar and opened the door to admit a figure that seemed to fill the doorway. Daniel Coltrane was even larger than he had appeared at a distance, well over 6 feet tall, with the broad shoulders and corded muscles of a man accustomed to physical labor. His dark hair was tied back with a leather cord, and his weathered face bore the kind of lines that came from years of squinting into sun and wind. Most striking were his eyes, pale gray, almost colorless, with an intensity that suggested he missed very little of what happened around him. When he looked at Margaret, she felt as if he was cataloguing everything about her in a single glance. "Mum," he said with a slight nod, then turned his attention to Thomas. "You folks all right? No injuries or illness?" "We're fine," Thomas replied, clearly struggling with a mixture of gratitude and masculine pride. "Grateful for the help, Daniel. Wasn't sure anyone was going to come." Daniel stepped fully into the cabin, moving with a fluid grace that seemed at odds with his size. Margaret noticed that despite hours of work in the forest, his clothing was remarkably clean and his equipment was arranged with military precision. "Situation's not completely resolved yet," Daniel said, accepting the cup of coffee Thomas offered. "Still got the big male and maybe 6 others. They're the smart ones, managed to avoid the snares and stayed out of rifle range." Margaret found her voice. "How did you eliminate so many of them so quietly?" Daniel's pale eyes fixed on her with what might have been approval. "Combination of methods, ma'am. Snares positioned along their movement patterns, some specialized. Traps, and when necessary, close work with a knife." The casual way he mentioned knife work sent a chill through Margaret. She was beginning to understand that Daniel Coltrane was not just a skilled hunter, but someone capable of lethal efficiency that bordered on the professional. "The remaining animals," Thomas asked. "What's your plan for dealing with them?" Daniel set down his coffee cup and moved to the window, studying the moonlit landscape with the focused attention of a military strategist. "The big male is the key. He's the one that's been coordinating their attacks, teaching the others to work together. Remove him, and the rest will scatter back to their natural territories." Margaret absorbed this information with growing understanding. "You're not just hunting individual animals, you're dismantling their social structure." Daniel turned to look at her with genuine surprise, as if he hadn't expected such insight from a woman in a wedding dress. "That's exactly right, ma'am. These Boars have developed pack behaviors that aren't natural to their species. Someone or something taught them to work together, and they've been passing that knowledge to younger animals." The implications of this statement hit Margaret like a revelation. "You mean this isn't just a temporary problem? They're creating a new kind of threat that could spread throughout the region." "Already has spread," Daniel confirmed grimly. "I've tracked similar groups as far south as the Rogue River Valley and as far north as the Columbia. If it's not stopped, here you'll have organized boar armies moving through every settled area in Oregon." Thomas absorbed this information with obvious shock. "You're talking about a threat to the entire territorial settlement program." Daniel nodded. "Which is why I'm not charging you folks for this work. This is bigger than one homestead or one family. This is about whether human beings are going to be able to live in this part of the country. Margaret felt a surge of respect for this strange, dangerous man who had apparently taken on a territorial-wide crisis as a personal responsibility. "What do you need from us?" Daniel studied her face with those unsettling grey eyes. "Need you to trust me for about 6 more hours while I finish what I started. After that, we need to talk about what happens next." "What happens next?" Thomas asked. Daniel moved toward the door, preparing to return to his deadly work. "That depends on whether you folks are planning to stay and build something permanent, or whether you're going to cut your losses and head back east like most of the others." The question hung in the air as Daniel slipped back into the night, leaving Margaret and Thomas to contemplate a future that neither of them had imagined when they had first corresponded about marriage and homesteading. Margaret realized that the crisis had forced her to discover capabilities she hadn't known she possessed, while also revealing the true nature of the challenges they would face if they chose to remain in Oregon. The question was no longer whether they could survive the immediate threat, but whether they were prepared to commit to a life that would require constant vigilance and adaptation to dangers that civilized society had never prepared them to face. Outside, the methodical elimination of the remaining Boars continued with a silence that was somehow more terrifying than the noise of open battle would have been. Dawn brought silence. For the first time in 6 days, Margaret woke to the absence of grunting, snuffling, and the heavy sound of hooves trampling around the cabin. The oppressive sense of being watched had vanished, replaced by the normal sounds of morning birds and wind through the trees. She found Daniel Coltrane sitting on the front porch, cleaning his rifle with methodical precision. His buckskin clothing showed evidence of the night's work, dark stains that Margaret preferred not to examine too closely, but his expression was calm, almost peaceful. "It's finished?" she asked, stepping outside for the first time in nearly a week. "The immediate threat is eliminated," Daniel replied, not looking up from his weapon maintenance. "The lead Boar and his core group won't be organizing any more raids." Margaret surveyed the homestead, taking inventory of the damage the siege had inflicted. The vegetable garden was completely destroyed. The barn was a pile of splinters, and deep gouges in the earth marked where the Boars had rooted for anything edible. But the destruction, while extensive, was no longer spreading. Thomas emerged from the cabin carrying 2 cups of coffee, offering one to Daniel before settling on the porch steps. The 3 of them sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, each processing the events of the past week in their own way. "What now?" Thomas finally asked. Daniel finished reassembling his rifle before answering. "Now you decide whether you're homesteaders or refugees." Margaret studied the hunter's weathered face, recognizing that he was offering them more than just commentary on their situation. "What do you mean?" Daniel gestured toward the damaged property around them. "What happened here is going to happen again. Maybe not next month, maybe not next year, but it will happen. The boar population in the Cascades is growing faster than the available food supply. They're going to keep moving into settled areas, and they're going to keep learning from each encounter with humans." Thomas absorbed this information with obvious reluctance. "So you're saying we should abandon the homestead?" "I'm saying you should understand what you're choosing if you stay," Daniel corrected. "This isn't going to be the kind of farming operation you could run back in Pennsylvania. This is going to be frontier warfare with brief intervals of agricultural work." Margaret found herself intrigued rather than discouraged by this assessment. What would it take to make a success of it? Daniel turned those pale grey eyes on her with renewed interest. "Different approach entirely. Instead of trying to farm like you're in settled country, you farm like you're in hostile territory. Defensive agriculture, mobile operations, cooperation with neighbors instead of isolated homesteading." "You make it sound like military operations," Thomas observed. Because that's what it is, Daniel replied matter-of-factly. You're not just competing with weather and market prices. You're fighting for the right to occupy territory that other species consider their own. Margaret stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the land that Thomas had hoped would provide them with security and prosperity. The morning light revealed the full extent of the damage, but it also revealed the underlying richness of the soil and the strategic advantages of the location. What would this defensive agriculture look like in practice? She asked. Daniel joined her at the porch railing, pointing toward various features of the landscape as he spoke. First, you abandon the idea of fixed installations, build structures that can be relocated or rebuilt quickly. Second, you establish early warning systems and communication networks with other homesteaders. Third, you diversify your food sources so you're not dependent on crops that can be destroyed in a single raid. Margaret nodded, her mind already working through the implications. And fourth, you maintain the capability to fight back effectively when prevention fails. Daniel smiled for the first time since she had met him, an expression that transformed his stern features into something almost approachable. You learn quickly, Mum. Thomas looked between them with growing concern. You're talking about living like soldiers, not farmers. Margaret, is that really what you came west to find? Margaret considered his question carefully. The life Daniel was describing bore no resemblance to the domestic security she had originally sought, but it also bore no resemblance to the suffocating limitations she had fled in Philadelphia. I came west to build something meaningful with someone who valued my capabilities, she said slowly. The circumstances are different than we expected, but the fundamental opportunity might still exist. Daniel nodded approvingly. The frontier rewards people who can adapt. It destroys people who can't. Thomas stood up abruptly, pacing across the porch with obvious agitation. This is insane. You're asking us to give up any hope of normal life. Normal marriage, normal farming, for what? The privilege of fighting wild animals for the rest of our lives. Margaret felt a pang of sympathy for Thomas's frustration, but she also recognized that his vision of normal life was exactly what she had traveled 2,000 miles to escape. Thomas, what if normal isn't what we should be aiming for? What do you mean? Margaret gestured toward the forest, where Daniel had systematically eliminated an entire sounder of boars through methods that would have been impossible for conventional farmers. What if we have the opportunity to pioneer something entirely new, a way of living that combines agricultural development with the kind of strategic thinking Daniel demonstrated last night? Daniel was watching this exchange with obvious interest, but he remained silent, allowing Margaret and Thomas to work through their fundamental disagreement about the future. Margaret, Thomas said with obvious pain, I brought you here to be my wife, to build a family, to create the kind of stable life that civilized people deserve, not to become some kind of frontier warrior. Margaret felt her heart constrict at the genuine anguish in Thomas's voice. He was a good man who had offered her partnership and respect, and she had developed real affection for him during their brief time together. But she was also beginning to understand that their visions of partnership were fundamentally incompatible. Thomas, she said gently, what if the kind of life civilized people deserve isn't available in this place and time? What if we have to create something new before we can have something stable? Thomas stared at her for a long moment, and Margaret could see him recognizing that the woman who had stepped off the train was not the same person who was standing before him now. The crisis had changed her in ways that made their original arrangement impossible. You want to stay, he said finally, not with me, but with him. He gestured toward Daniel. Margaret felt her cheeks burn, but she forced herself to address the implication directly. I want to stay and learn how to survive in a place that requires capabilities I'm only beginning to discover. Whether that's with you, with Daniel, or on my own, is something we all need to figure out." Daniel finally spoke, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. "Thomas, you're a good farmer and a decent man. But this isn't farming country anymore, and decency won't keep you alive when the next sounder comes down from the mountains." Thomas turned to face the hunter with obvious resentment. "And I suppose you're offering to teach my fiancé how to become a killer like yourself?" Daniel's expression didn't change, but Margaret sensed danger in his stillness. "I'm offering to teach anyone who's willing to learn how to stay alive long enough to build something worth protecting. Whether that includes you is your choice." Margaret stepped between the two men, recognizing that masculine pride was about to complicate an already difficult situation. "This isn't about choosing between two men. This is about choosing between two ways of life." She looked directly at Thomas, hoping he could understand the decision she was making. "I care about you, Thomas. You offered me partnership and respect when I had nothing, but the partnership you were offering was based on a world that doesn't exist in this place." Thomas's shoulders sagged as he absorbed the finality in her voice. "So you're choosing his world instead?" "I'm choosing to learn how to survive in the world that actually exists," Margaret corrected. "If you want to learn alongside me, I would welcome your partnership. If not, I understand." Thomas looked around the damaged homestead, at the evidence of destruction that surrounded them, and at the two people who were prepared to adapt to circumstances he found unacceptable. "I can't live like this," he said finally. "I can't spend my life fighting animals and sleeping with weapons within reach, and never knowing if tomorrow is going to bring another siege." Margaret nodded, feeling genuine sadness for the dream they were both abandoning. "I understand, and I think you're making the right choice for yourself." Daniel stepped forward, extending his hand to Thomas. "There's no shame in recognizing what you can and can't handle. The territorial capital is always looking for administrators and clerks. A man with your education could do well there." Thomas shook Daniel's hand with obvious reluctance, then turned to Margaret. "What about our engagement, our plans?" Margaret slipped the simple ring Thomas had given her off her finger and pressed it into his palm. "Our engagement was based on promises neither of us can keep, but I'll always be grateful for the courage you showed in bringing me west." As Thomas prepared to leave for Cedar Ridge, and eventually for a life more suited to his temperament, Margaret found herself facing a future more uncertain, but also more exciting than anything she had originally imagined. She was no longer a mail-order bride seeking security through marriage. She was becoming something entirely new, a woman prepared to master the skills necessary for survival in a world that demanded constant adaptation and strategic thinking. Daniel Coltrane had offered to teach her those skills, but Margaret was beginning to suspect that the education would transform her in ways that neither of them yet fully understood. 3 weeks after Thomas departed for Cedar Ridge, Margaret stood knee-deep in a mountain stream, her hands steady despite the icy water, as she positioned a fish trap according to Daniel's precise instructions. The morning sun filtering through the forest canopy revealed how drastically her appearance had changed since arriving in Oregon. Gone was the carefully maintained appearance of an Eastern lady. Her dark hair was now braided in a practical style that stayed out of her way during physical work. Her dress had been replaced by split skirts and sturdy boots more suited to rough terrain. Most significantly, her hands, once soft and pale from indoor living, now showed the calluses and scars of someone learning to work with tools, weapons, and the unforgiving materials of frontier life. "Upstream about 6 inches," Daniel called, from the bank where he was constructing a second trap. "Water's going to run faster there when the afternoon melt comes down from the peaks." Margaret adjusted the positioning, feeling satisfaction as the woven willow structure settled into the stream bed exactly as Daniel had taught her. Over the past 3 weeks, she had been absorbing knowledge at a pace that surprised both her teacher and herself. Daniel Coltrane, she had discovered, was far more than just a skilled hunter. He was a walking encyclopedia of frontier survival techniques, accumulated through years of solitary living in some of the most challenging terrain in the Oregon Territory. More importantly, he was a gifted teacher who could break down complex skills into manageable components. The key to surviving out here, Daniel had explained during her first lesson in trap construction, isn't knowing one skill really well. It's knowing dozens of skills well enough to adapt when circumstances change. Margaret had taken this philosophy to heart, throwing herself into an education that would have shocked her former social circle in Philadelphia. She had learned to read animal tracks, identify edible plants, construct shelters from available materials, and maintain weapons with professional competence. But the most valuable lesson Daniel had taught her was how to think strategically about survival challenges. Most people who fail out here make the same mistake, he had told her, while teaching her to identify boar sign along game trails. They react to immediate problems instead of anticipating long-term patterns. Margaret finished securing the fish trap and waded back to shore, where Daniel was waiting with the morning's lesson materials, a collection of plant specimens that would teach her the difference between nutritious wild foods and ones that could kill her. "Today we're going to work on botanical identification," Daniel said, arranging the specimens on a flat rock. "Winter's coming and you need to know what's available when hunting becomes more difficult." Margaret settled beside him, notebook ready, to record the information he was about to share. She had maintained her academic habits despite the dramatic change in subject matter, keeping detailed records of everything Daniel taught her. "This one," Daniel said, holding up a cluster of berries, "looks similar to elderberries, but notice the leaf pattern and the way the fruit clusters hang. These will make you sick enough to wish you were dead." Margaret studied the specimen carefully, noting the subtle differences that distinguished it from its safe counterpart. "How do you remember all these distinctions?" "Practice and consequences," Daniel replied with dry humor. "Make a mistake with plant identification, and you either learn from it or you don't get a chance to make another mistake." As the lesson continued, Margaret found herself impressed not just by Daniel's knowledge, but by his teaching methods. He never simply told her what to remember. He helped her understand the underlying principles that would allow her to make correct identifications, even when encountering unfamiliar varieties. "The goal," he explained, "is to develop judgment, not just memorize a list. The frontier is going to present you with situations that aren't covered in any textbook." Margaret absorbed this wisdom while practicing the skills Daniel demonstrated. Her academic background, she was discovering, provided an excellent foundation for frontier education. The analytical thinking her father had taught her proved invaluable for understanding the complex relationships between different survival techniques. "You learn faster than most men I've taught," Daniel observed, as Margaret successfully identified a series of plant specimens without assistance. "Most people want simple rules they can follow without thinking. You want to understand the principles behind the rules." Margaret felt a flush of pride at his approval, but also recognized the deeper implications of his comment. "Most of the men you've taught probably had other options if they failed to master these skills. I don't." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "That might be part of it, but I think it's more than that. You're not just learning to survive, you're learning to understand your environment well enough to predict and control it." Margaret considered this observation as they moved on to the afternoon's lesson in weapons maintenance. Daniel had insisted that she master rifle care before he would allow her to practice marksmanship, arguing that an unreliable weapon was more dangerous than no weapon at all. "Tell me about the boar situation in other parts of the territory," Margaret said, as she cleaned her rifle according to Daniel's exacting standards. "You mentioned that organized groups have been reported as far north as the Columbia River." Daniel's expression grew serious. "It's worse than I initially thought. I've been corresponding with hunters and territorial authorities throughout Oregon. The pattern we saw here, intelligent coordination, strategic planning, persistent siege tactics, it's been reported in at least a dozen different locations." Margaret paused in her weapon cleaning, struck by the implications. "You're describing an environmental crisis that could affect the entire territorial settlement program." "Exactly. And the territorial government doesn't seem to understand the scope of the problem. They're treating each incident as an isolated case of nuisance wildlife instead of recognizing the coordinated threat." Margaret felt her analytical mind engaging with the problem on a broader scale. What would it take to document the pattern, convincingly enough to get territorial authorities to take appropriate action? Daniel studied her with those pale grey eyes, and Margaret sensed that she had asked exactly the question he had been hoping to hear. Systematic investigation, field reports from multiple locations, evidence that demonstrates the coordinated nature of the threat. "And you think I could contribute to that kind of investigation?" "I think you could lead it," Daniel replied. "You've got the education to document findings in ways that territorial authorities would respect. You've got the field skills to gather information safely, and you've got the strategic thinking to see patterns that others might miss." Margaret felt excitement building as she considered the possibilities. Here was an opportunity to use her, developing survival skills for something larger than just personal safety, a chance to contribute to the territorial development effort in ways that could affect thousands of settlers. What would such an investigation involve? Daniel moved to the window, looking out over the rebuilt homestead that had become their base of operations. Over the past 3 weeks, they had constructed a series of mobile structures designed to be relocated quickly if necessary. The garden had been replanted with fast-growing crops that could be harvested before winter, and early warning systems had been established with the few remaining neighbors. Travel to affected areas throughout the territory, interview survivors, document attack patterns, identify the leadership structure of boar groups, map their territories, and predict where they're likely to strike next. Margaret absorbed this information, recognizing both the opportunity and the dangers involved. How long would such an investigation take? Months, maybe a full year. We'd be traveling constantly, often in areas where normal law enforcement doesn't exist. Living rough, depending entirely on our own resources. The life Daniel was describing bore no resemblance to anything Margaret had ever imagined for herself, but it also offered exactly the kind of meaningful work she had always craved, intellectually challenging, practically important, and genuinely pioneering. "When would we start?" she asked. Daniel's rare smile appeared again. "Soon as you can hit a moving target at 50 yards and construct a shelter that will keep you alive in a mountain blizzard." Margaret looked down at the rifle in her hands, then out at the wilderness that had become her classroom. 6 weeks ago, she had been a desperate woman fleeing failure and seeking security through marriage to a stranger. Now she was preparing to undertake an investigation that could influence the future of an entire territory. The transformation was remarkable, but Margaret recognized that it was only the beginning. The skills Daniel was teaching her were preparing her for challenges that would test every aspect of her character and intelligence. "How long do I have to master those skills?" she asked. "Winter's still 2 months away," Daniel replied. "Should be enough time if you're willing to work as hard as you have been." Margaret nodded, feeling the same determination that had carried her from Philadelphia to Oregon, now focusing on this new goal. She was no longer learning to survive. She was learning to shape her environment and contribute to something larger than herself. The mail-order bride was gone, replaced by someone preparing to become a territorial investigator, specializing in threats that conventional authorities couldn't handle. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was exactly the kind of life she was discovering she wanted to build. The test came without warning on a crisp October morning when Margaret was practicing long-range shooting in the meadow behind their homestead. She had just successfully hit a target at 75 yards when Daniel's urgent whistle echoed from the forest. 3 sharp blasts that meant immediate danger approaching. Margaret dropped into the crouch position Daniel had drilled into her, scanning the tree line for threats while keeping her rifle ready. Her heart raced, but her mind remained clear, automatically running through the response protocols they had practiced dozens of times. Daniel emerged from the forest at a dead run, his expression grim. New sounder moving in from the northeast, bigger than the last group, maybe 60 animals. They'll be here within the hour. Margaret felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with fierce satisfaction. After 2 months of intensive training, she was finally going to test her abilities against the same kind of threat that had initially trapped her in helpless terror. Same leadership pattern as before? She asked, checking her ammunition while mentally reviewing everything Daniel had taught her about boar behavior. Worse. This group's got multiple coordinators, at least 3 large males working together. And they're being more systematic than any group I've tracked before. Margaret absorbed this information with the analytical clarity her training had developed. They're learning from the failure of the previous group, adapting their tactics. Exactly, which means our standard defensive strategies might not be sufficient. Margaret looked around their rebuilt homestead, noting the improvements they had made since Thomas's departure. The structures were designed for quick relocation. The food supplies were distributed among multiple concealed caches, and early warning systems extended in all directions. But facing 60 coordinated boars would strain their preparations to the breaking point. Options? She asked, falling into the tactical discussion pattern that had become second nature during their training sessions. Daniel was already moving toward the cabin, gathering equipment with practiced efficiency. We can evacuate to the mountain cave system and wait them out. We can attempt a mobile defense, harassing them until they lose interest. Or we can make a stand here and try to break their coordination like we did with the last group. Margaret weighed the alternatives with the strategic thinking Daniel had taught her to develop. Each option carried significant risks, but also potential advantages that could serve their larger investigation goals. If we evacuate, we lose the opportunity to study their advanced tactics, she observed. If we attempt mobile defense, we might be overwhelmed before we can establish effective harassment patterns. Daniel paused in his preparations to look at her with approval. And if we make a stand, we get the chance to test whether our improved defenses can handle a coordinated assault by a larger, more intelligent enemy force. Margaret felt a moment of surprise at her own words. 2 months ago, the prospect of deliberately engaging in combat with dangerous animals would have terrified her beyond rational thought. Now she was analyzing the strategic merits of different combat options with the same calm focus she had once applied to academic problems. There's another consideration, Daniel said, securing weapons and ammunition in positions around the homestead. If this group is as advanced as I think they are, they represent the next stage in the evolution of this threat. Learning how to defeat them could be crucial for protecting other settlements throughout the territory. Margaret nodded, recognizing the truth of his assessment. Their investigation had revealed that Boar groups were becoming increasingly sophisticated in their tactics. Successfully defending against this advanced force would provide valuable intelligence about countering future threats. We make our stand, she decided. But we do it smart, use every advantage our preparations can provide. Daniel's rare smile appeared as he handed her a bandolier of ammunition. That's what I was hoping you'd say. They spent the next 40 minutes implementing their defensive plan with the precision of a military operation. Margaret took position in the fortified loft Daniel had constructed in the main cabin, where she would have clear fields of fire in multiple directions while remaining protected from direct assault. Daniel positioned himself in a concealed blind near the stream, where he could strike at the Boars' flanks while they focused their attention on the main buildings. Between them, they had established overlapping fields of fire that would allow them to support each other while making it difficult for the Boars to coordinate effective attacks. Most importantly, they had prepared multiple fallback positions, connected by concealed passages that would allow them to relocate quickly if their primary defenses were overwhelmed. Remember, Daniel called from his position, these aren't the same animals we faced before. They're going to probe for weaknesses, test our responses, and adapt their tactics based on what they learn. Margaret settled into her shooting position, checking her rifle one final time while scanning the forest edge for signs of approaching movement. The waiting was the hardest part. The minutes of tense anticipation before combat began. She used the time to review everything Daniel had taught her about reading boar behavior, identifying leadership animals, and disrupting group coordination. The key was to remain analytical even in the midst of action, making tactical decisions based on observation rather than emotion. The first boars appeared at the forest edge exactly when Daniel had predicted, massive animals that moved with the confident purpose of creatures accustomed to dominating their environment. Margaret studied them through her rifle scope, noting the way they positioned themselves to survey the homestead before committing to an attack. "I count 4 coordinators," she called softly to Daniel. 2 on the north side, 2 on the south. "They're establishing overlapping command zones." "Confirmed," Daniel replied. "And they're taking time to study our defensive preparations. These animals have definitely learned from previous encounters with humans." Margaret watched with fascination as the boar coordinators directed other members of their group into positions that would allow for simultaneous assault from multiple directions. The level of tactical sophistication was remarkable and deeply concerning for its implications about the threat these animals posed to isolated settlements. "They're ready to move," Daniel observed as the boars completed their preliminary positioning. "Remember the plan. Target the coordinators first, disrupt their command structure, then focus on breaking up group formations." Margaret took careful aim at the largest coordinator, a massive male with distinctive scarring on his left shoulder. At this range, with a clear target and stable shooting position, she was confident of making the shot that would begin their defense. The coordinator raised its head as if sensing the threat and looked directly toward her concealed position. For a moment, woman and beast regarded each other across the distance, predator and prey, intelligence and instinct, civilization and wilderness locked in mutual recognition of the battle about to begin. Margaret squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed across the homestead like thunder, and the scarred coordinator collapsed with a squeal that galvanized the entire boar force into immediate action. What followed was unlike anything Margaret had experienced, a coordinated assault that tested every skill Daniel had taught her and every aspect of their defensive preparations. The Boars didn't charge mindlessly toward the buildings as she had expected. Instead, they executed a complex maneuver that brought attackers toward her position from 3 different directions, while other animals moved to flank Daniel's concealed blind. Margaret worked her rifle with mechanical precision, targeting animals that threatened to overwhelm their defensive positions while calling out intelligence about enemy movements to Daniel. The noise was tremendous. Squealing boars, rifle shots echoing between the buildings, and the crash of heavy bodies against wooden structures. But through it all, Margaret maintained the analytical focus Daniel had trained her to develop. She could see the patterns in the boars' movements, identify the moments when their coordination faltered, and exploit the brief opportunities when individual animals became separated from group support. "North coordinator down," she called as her fourth shot found its target. Groups are starting to fragment on that side. Daniel's rifle cracked in response, and another coordinator collapsed near the stream. Without their leadership, the attacking boars began to show signs of confusion, their organized assault deteriorating into the kind of individual aggression that was much easier to handle. But even as the immediate assault faltered, Margaret could see that this was far from over. The surviving coordinators were already regrouping their forces, adapting their tactics based on what they had learned from the first wave of attacks. "They're learning," she called to Daniel, "adjusting their approach in real time." "I see it," Daniel replied, relocating to his secondary position as boars moved to surround his original blind. "This is going to be a longer fight than I expected." Margaret smiled grimly as she reloaded her rifle and prepared for the next phase of the battle. This was exactly the kind of challenge she had been training for, a test that would prove whether she had truly mastered the skills necessary for survival in a hostile environment. The mail-order bride was gone forever, replaced by a frontier warrior who was about to discover the full extent of her capabilities. The Morrison homestead had been abandoned for 3 weeks, but the signs of what had happened there were still written in the earth like a gruesome story. Margaret crouched beside a series of tracks in the dried mud near what had been the front porch, her trained eye now capable of reading the tale they told. "Multiple species," she murmured, sketching the track patterns in her field notebook. "Boars? Definitely, but also something else. These prints." She pointed to a series of impressions that were disturbingly human-like, but somehow wrong in their proportions. Daniel knelt beside her, his face grim as he studied the evidence. Larger than normal human feet, and look at the toe spacing. Plus, they're deeper than they should be for someone walking upright. Margaret measured the tracks carefully, noting details that would have meant nothing to her 6 months ago, but now provided crucial intelligence about their quarry. The mysterious figure Tom Bradley had described was becoming more real with each piece of evidence they uncovered. They had spent the morning investigating 2 other abandoned homesteads, finding similar patterns of destruction and the same unsettling mix of boar sign and something else entirely. But the Morrison place was different. Here, they could see clear evidence of the coordination between the different elements of the attacks. "Look at this," Margaret called Daniel over to an area near the barn ruins. "The boar tracks form a clear perimeter around the property, but these other prints move between different positions, like someone was directing the deployment." Daniel nodded, his pale eyes scanning the surrounding forest with heightened alertness. "We're getting close to something that doesn't want to be found. Stay sharp." Margaret felt the familiar mixture of fear and excitement that had become her constant companion during these investigations. She was no longer the terrified woman who had barricaded herself in Thomas Hartwell's cabin. She was someone who could read danger signs and respond appropriately to threats. They moved toward the house itself, where the most disturbing evidence awaited them. The structure hadn't been destroyed so much as systematically dismantled, as if someone had been searching for specific items or information. "This isn't random destruction," Margaret observed, examining the methodical way furniture had been overturned and personal belongings scattered. "Someone was looking for something." Daniel picked up a family photograph from the debris, studying the faces of the Morrison family who had once called this place home. Question is whether they found what they were looking for. And what happened to the family? Margaret felt a chill as she processed the implications. If the intelligence behind the boar attacks was sophisticated enough to conduct searches of abandoned properties, it suggested planning that went far beyond simple territorial. Expansion. A sound from the forest behind the house made both of them freeze. It was a low, rhythmic grunting that could have been Boars, but carried an organized quality that suggested communication rather than random animal noise. Daniel motioned for silence and moved to the window, peering carefully through a gap in the broken shutters. Margaret joined him, her rifle ready, and saw what made her breath catch in her throat. A line of Boars was moving through the trees in single file, but they weren't foraging or exploring randomly. They were patrolling, following a specific route with military precision. And at the head of the column walked a figure that was definitely not entirely animal. The creature stood nearly 7 feet tall, on legs that bent wrong for human anatomy. Its body was covered in coarse hair, similar to the Boars it accompanied, but its torso was more upright than any quadruped should manage. Most disturbing were its arms, too long, ending in hands that displayed both human-like dexterity and animal-like claws. "What in God's name is that thing?" Margaret whispered, her academic mind struggling to categorize what she was observing. Daniel's response was grimly practical. "Something that explains how the Boars learned military tactics, and something that's going to notice we're here if we don't move carefully." As they watched, the creature stopped and made a series of complex vocalizations that prompted immediate responses from the Boars. The animals spread out in a search pattern that would systematically cover the abandoned homestead and surrounding area. "They're hunting us," Margaret realized with cold clarity. Daniel was already moving toward the back of the house, motioning for Margaret to follow. "There's a root cellar out back. If we can reach it without being seen, we might be able to wait them out." Margaret gathered her equipment as quickly and quietly as possible, her mind automatically cataloguing observations, even as terror threatened to overwhelm her analytical training. The creature's behavior suggested intelligence that was at least equal to human capabilities, combined with physical abilities that were clearly superior. They slipped out the back door and across the yard toward the root cellar, using the cover of outbuildings to avoid detection. Behind them, Margaret could hear the search party systematically working through the house, accompanied by vocalizations between the creature and its Boar companions. The root cellar was a standard frontier construction, a stone-lined pit covered with heavy wooden doors that provided protection from weather and raiders. Daniel lifted one of the doors just far enough for them to slip inside, then lowered it carefully to avoid making noise. The interior was dark, damp, and filled with the scent of stored vegetables that had long since rotted. Margaret fought down, in claustrophobia, as she and Daniel settled into hiding positions that allowed them to hear what was happening above. The search of the property continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Margaret could hear heavy footsteps moving around the cellar entrance, pausing occasionally, as if the creature was testing for signs of recent human presence. When the sounds finally moved away, Margaret and Daniel remained motionless for another full hour before Daniel cautiously lifted the cellar door to check that the area was clear. "Gone," he whispered, but kept his rifle ready as they emerged into the afternoon sunlight. Margaret's legs were shaking as they climbed out of the cellar, but her mind was racing with the implications of what they had witnessed. "Daniel, that creature, it was clearly intelligent, clearly capable of complex planning and communication. What are we dealing with?" Daniel's expression was troubled as he scanned the forest around them. "Something that shouldn't exist according to conventional natural science. But the frontier has always been home to things that don't fit civilized categories." Margaret felt her academic training asserting itself despite her fear. "We need to document this. Sketch the creature, record its behavior patterns, gather physical evidence if possible. The territorial authorities will never believe our reports without proof. And we need to figure out how many of these things exist and what their ultimate goals are," Daniel added. If they can organize boar armies, what else might they be capable of? As they prepared to leave the Morrison homestead, Margaret spotted something that made her call Daniel back to the house. Partially hidden under debris near the front door was a leather journal that had somehow escaped the systematic search. "This belonged to James Morrison," Margaret said, recognizing the name from territorial records. "Maybe it contains information about what he observed before the attack." Daniel kept watch, while Margaret carefully extracted the journal and began reading the final entries. What she found confirmed their worst fears and raised new questions that were even more disturbing. "Listen to this," Margaret read from Morrison's final entry, dated just 2 days before his homestead was attacked. "The thing in the woods has been watching us for weeks. Sarah thinks I'm imagining it, but I've seen it 3 times now, always. At the edge of the clearing, always studying our routines like it's planning something. It's not natural, walks upright like a man, but moves like an animal. And the boars that used to avoid our property are getting bolder, like something is encouraging them to lose their fear of humans." Margaret looked up from the journal with growing dread. Daniel, Morrison was documenting the same creature we just saw, and it was conducting surveillance operations weeks before the actual attack. Daniel absorbed this information with the grim expression of someone who understood the implications, which means there are probably more of them, and they're coordinating activities across a much wider area than we realized. Margaret carefully packed the journal with her other documentation, recognizing that they had uncovered evidence of a threat that went far beyond anything the territorial government was prepared to handle. The organized boar attacks were just one component of a larger campaign being waged by intelligent creatures that combined animal cunning with human-level strategic thinking. "We need to get this information to the territorial capital immediately," Margaret said, as they began their cautious retreat from the Morrison homestead. "Agreed," Daniel replied, "but first we need to figure out how to convince authorities that we're not suffering from frontier madness. Reports about half-human creatures coordinating animal armies aren't going to be received well by bureaucrats who've never left Salem." Margaret nodded, understanding the challenge they faced. She had documented evidence of a threat that challenged fundamental assumptions about the natural world, but proving the reality of that threat to skeptical officials would require more than field notes and witness testimony. As they made their way back toward Willow Creek, Margaret found herself thinking about how far she had traveled, not just geographically, but in terms of personal transformation. 6 months ago, she had been a conventional Eastern lady seeking security through marriage. Now she was a frontier investigator, gathering intelligence about creatures that weren't supposed to exist. The investigation that had begun as academic exercise was becoming a race against time to warn territorial authorities about a threat that could end human settlement in Oregon permanently. Margaret just hoped they could find a way to make their incredible discoveries credible to people who had never seen the evidence they were documenting. The territorial Capitol building in Salem had never hosted a meeting quite like the one Margaret found herself addressing. Governor Isaac Stevens sat at the head of a long oak table, flanked by territorial legislators, military commanders, and federal land office officials who had traveled from as far as San Francisco to hear her report. Margaret stood at the far end of the room, her field-worn clothing and sun-darkened complexion a stark contrast to the formal attire of the assembled officials. In her hands, she held the documentation that represented months of dangerous investigation. Maps, sketches, witness testimonies, and physical evidence that told a story most of these men would have dismissed as frontier folklore if it had come from anyone else. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the authority she had developed through survival and investigation, "what I'm about to present challenges conventional understanding of the wildlife crisis in Oregon Territory. I ask that you reserve judgment until you've examined all the evidence. Governor Stevens, a man in his 40s with the bearing of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions, gestured for her to continue. "Miss Thornfield, your preliminary reports have been extraordinary. Please proceed with your full findings." Margaret unrolled her master map of the territory, marked with dozens of documented attacks across a region spanning hundreds of square miles. The boar attacks throughout Oregon are not random wildlife incidents. They represent a coordinated campaign being conducted by intelligent entities that have weaponized wild animal populations against human settlements. A murmur ran through the assembled officials. Colonel Marcus Webb, the territorial military commander, leaned forward with obvious skepticism. "Miss Thornfield, you're describing military operations conducted by animals. Surely you understand how that sounds to professional soldiers." Margaret had anticipated this response. She moved to an easel where she had prepared detailed sketches of the creature she and Daniel had observed. "Colonel Webb, I'm describing military operations conducted by entities that combine human-level intelligence with physical capabilities that exceed normal human parameters." The sketch showed the 7-foot creature in precise detail, the elongated limbs, the mixture of human and animal characteristics, the tool-using capabilities that Margaret had documented during her investigations. Several officials shifted uncomfortably as they studied the drawing. "You're claiming to have observed some kind of—" "What exactly?" asked Dr. Harrison Mitchell, the territorial naturalist who had been brought in to evaluate Margaret's biological findings. "I'm claiming to have documented the existence of intelligent beings that are coordinating systematic attacks on human settlements using organized boar populations as their primary weapon," Margaret replied evenly. "Whether these beings represent an unknown species, some form of human deviation, or something else entirely, is beyond my ability to determine with available resources." She moved to a second easel, displaying her analysis of attack patterns. "What I can determine is that these attacks follow strategic principles that indicate sophisticated planning, reconnaissance, and tactical adaptation. The evidence supports coordination between multiple entities across the entire territorial region." Governor Stevens studied the documentation with the careful attention of someone who understood that policy decisions would depend on the accuracy of Margaret's findings. "Miss Thornfield, the implications of what you're describing would require a fundamental revision of our territorial settlement strategy. Are you certain of your conclusions?" Margaret appreciated the governor's direct approach. "Governor Stevens, I've spent 6 months investigating these incidents personally. I've interviewed survivors, examined physical evidence, and observed these entities in operation. I'm as certain as empirical observation can make me." Federal Land Commissioner Robert Caldwell, a portly man with the soft hands of someone who spent his time in offices rather than outdoors, spoke up with obvious irritation. "Even if we accept Miss Thornfield's creative interpretation of wildlife behavior, what exactly are we supposed to do about it? The federal government has invested millions in territorial development. We can't abandon Oregon because of some unusual animal activity." Margaret felt her temper flare at the dismissive tone, but kept her voice level. "Commissioner Caldwell, we're not discussing unusual animal activity. We're discussing an intelligent enemy that has already driven hundreds of families from their homesteads and appears to be systematically eliminating human presence from large areas of the territory." Daniel Coltrane, who had been sitting quietly at the back of the room, finally spoke up. "Gentlemen, I've lived in Oregon for 15 years. I've hunted everything from wolves to bears to mountain lions. What Miss Thornfield documented doesn't fit any normal wildlife pattern. These attacks are being directed by something that understands human psychology and military tactics." Colonel Webb turned to address Daniel directly. "Mr. Coltrane, you have a reputation as a competent frontiersman. Are you seriously supporting Miss Thornfield's claims about creatures directing animal armies?" Daniel stood up, his presence commanding attention even in a room full of powerful officials. "I'm supporting her documentation of coordinated attacks that have eliminated human settlement from approximately 3,000 square miles of Oregon territory. Whatever is directing those attacks has capabilities that exceed anything in normal zoological experience." Margaret felt grateful for Daniel's support, but also recognized that they needed to move beyond debating the nature of their enemy to discussing practical responses to the threat. "The question," she said, redirecting the conversation, "is not whether these entities exist, but how we respond to the clear evidence that organized intelligence is working to eliminate human settlement in Oregon. We have 3 options." She moved to a third easel displaying her strategic analysis. "First, we can continue treating these as isolated wildlife incidents and watch human settlement collapse throughout the territory. Second, we can evacuate affected areas and cede large portions of Oregon to whatever force is driving these attacks. Third, we can develop coordinated countermeasures based on understanding the intelligence and capabilities of our opponents." Governor Stevens studied Margaret's strategic analysis with obvious interest. What would these countermeasures involve? Margaret had spent weeks developing her recommendations, drawing on everything she had learned about both the enemy's capabilities and the resources available to territorial authorities. Coordinated intelligence gathering to map the full extent of enemy operations, military-style defensive preparations for vulnerable settlements, active hunting operations targeting the entities directing the attacks, and most importantly, communication. Networks that allow rapid response to threats across the entire territorial region. Colonel Webb was studying Margaret's tactical recommendations with the attention of a professional soldier evaluating a military plan. "Miss Thornfield, you're describing counterinsurgency operations against an enemy whose capabilities we don't fully understand. That's an extremely dangerous undertaking. More dangerous than allowing this enemy to continue eliminating human settlements without organized resistance," Margaret replied. "Colonel, we've documented the systematic destruction of dozens of homesteads and the displacement of hundreds of families. Inaction is not a viable strategy." Dr. Mitchell raised a concern that Margaret had been expecting. "Even if we accept the existence of these entities, we have no understanding of their biology, their life cycles, their vulnerabilities. How do we combat something we can't classify scientifically?" Margaret smiled for the first time since entering the meeting room. "Dr. Mitchell, that's exactly why I'm recommending the establishment of a territorial research and response unit. We need systematic investigation combined with immediate defensive capabilities." She moved to her final presentation board, displaying her proposal for what she had termed the Oregon Territorial Defense Initiative, a coordinated effort combining military personnel, experienced frontiersmen, and scientific investigators. Mobile units capable of rapid response to threatened areas, research capabilities to gather intelligence about enemy operations, and communication networks to coordinate defensive efforts across the entire territory. Governor Stevens was studying the proposal with obvious interest, but also obvious concern about the resources it would require. "Miss Thornfield, you're describing a substantial commitment of territorial resources to combat a threat that challenges conventional understanding of natural science." Margaret met his gaze directly. "Governor, the alternative is watching Oregon territory become uninhabitable for human settlement. The evidence indicates that's already happening in large areas of the region." Commissioner Caldwell was shaking his head with obvious frustration. "This is preposterous. We're discussing military operations against mythological creatures based on the reports of a mail-order bride who claims to have become a wilderness expert." Margaret felt the familiar flash of anger that had sustained her through months of dangerous investigation. "Commissioner, I may have arrived in Oregon as a mail-order bride, but I've spent the past 6 months documenting evidence that could determine the future of human settlement in this territory. I suggest you evaluate that evidence based on its accuracy rather than your assumptions about my qualifications." Daniel stood up again, his voice carrying quiet menace. "Commissioner, Miss Thornfield has risked her life repeatedly to gather the intelligence you're dismissing. I'd recommend focusing on the substance of her findings rather than questioning her background." Governor Stevens raised his hand to restore order to the meeting. "Gentlemen, we're here to evaluate evidence and make policy decisions, not to debate personal qualifications. Miss Thornfield, I'd like you to provide detailed written recommendations for review by the Territorial Council. We'll reconvene in 1 week to make final decisions about resource allocation and strategic response." As the meeting adjourned, Margaret felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She had successfully presented her findings to territorial authorities, but now those authorities would decide whether to take action based on her recommendations or continue treating the crisis as isolated wildlife incidents. Walking out of the Capitol building with Daniel, Margaret realized that her transformation from desperate mail-order bride to territorial defense strategist was nearly complete. The question was whether her hard-won expertise would be enough to convince powerful men to take action against a threat that challenged their fundamental assumptions about the natural world. 1 year later, Margaret stood on the observation platform of Fort Cascade, the first installation of the Oregon Territorial Defense Initiative, watching her teams conduct training exercises in the valley below. The facility represented everything she had argued for in that contentious meeting in Salem: a combination of military preparedness, scientific research, and frontier expertise designed to protect human settlement against threats that conventional authorities had never imagined. The morning sun reflected off the polished brass of surveying equipment as her cartographers updated territorial maps with the latest intelligence about enemy movements. In the distance, she could see patrol units returning from week-long reconnaissance missions that had pushed the boundaries of known enemy territories further back into the wilderness. "Daily report, Director Thornfield," came a familiar voice. Behind her, Margaret turned to see Captain Samuel Rodriguez, the military officer who served as her second-in-command, approaching with the documentation that had become as routine as breakfast in her new life. The title still sounded strange to her ears, but she had grown into the authority it represented. "What's the situation in the southern sectors, Captain?" Margaret asked, accepting the reports while continuing to observe the training exercises below. Rodriguez, a career soldier who had initially been skeptical about taking orders from a woman with unconventional qualifications, had become one of her most trusted advisors. Team 7 encountered a reconnaissance probe near Grants Pass, 3 entities with approximately 20 Boars, conducting what appeared to be preliminary surveillance of settler activity. Margaret nodded, making mental notes for her strategic planning session later that morning. The enemy had adapted to their defensive measures by shifting tactics from direct assault to extended intelligence gathering, but her teams had adapted as well. "Response?" she asked. Daniel's unit intercepted them before they could complete their survey. 2 entities eliminated, 3rd escaped, Boar group scattered. No casualties on our side. Rodriguez paused, consulting his notes. "Daniel wanted me to tell you that the escaped entity was carrying equipment he hadn't seen before. Wants to brief you personally when he returns." Margaret felt the familiar mixture of satisfaction and concern that accompanied news of successful operations. Each victory against the entities provided valuable intelligence, but also revealed new capabilities that required constant adaptation of defensive strategies. Schedule the briefing for this afternoon, Margaret decided, and make sure Dr. Patterson examines any recovered equipment immediately. Dr. Elena Patterson had joined the initiative 6 months earlier, bringing expertise in xenobiology that helped make sense of the entity's physical capabilities and potential vulnerabilities. Her research had already led to improvements in weapons and tactics that made encounters with the creatures significantly less dangerous for human teams. As Rodriguez departed to coordinate the day's operations, Margaret reflected on the transformation of both her personal circumstances and the broader territorial situation. The Oregon Territorial Defense Initiative had evolved from her desperate recommendations into a successful model that was being replicated in other Western territories facing similar threats. More importantly, the systematic approach to combating the entities had shifted the balance of power decisively in favor of human settlement. Instead of being driven from their homes by mysterious attacks, settlers now lived in communities protected by early warning systems, rapid response teams, and the kind of coordinated defensive capabilities that made organized assaults prohibitively expensive for their enemies. The success hadn't come without cost. Margaret bore scars from 3 different encounters with entities during field operations, and she had lost team members whose courage and competence had made victory possible. But the alternative, abandoning Oregon to intelligent enemies who viewed human settlement as an invasion to be repelled, had never been acceptable. Director Thornfield, Dr. Patterson's voice interrupted her morning reflection. I have results from yesterday's recovered specimens that I think you'll find interesting. Margaret followed the scientist to the research facility that occupied the eastern wing of Fort Cascade. The laboratory represented a type of frontier installation that had never existed before. Sophisticated scientific equipment operated by researchers who were also trained for combat operations in hostile territory. What did you discover? Margaret asked, as Dr. Patterson led her to a table displaying artifacts recovered from recent encounters with the entities. Tool usage that indicates technological development beyond what we initially assumed, Dr. Patterson replied, pointing to a series of implements that looked like sophisticated hunting and construction equipment. These weren't scavenged from human settlements. They were manufactured specifically for entity use. Margaret studied the artifacts with growing concern. If the entities were developing their own technology, rather than simply adapting human tools, it suggested capabilities that went far beyond anything her teams had previously encountered. Implications for our defensive strategies? Margaret asked. Dr. Patterson's expression was troubled. They're not just intelligent animals using instinct and coordination. They're a technological civilization that's been deliberately concealing the extent of their capabilities. Margaret absorbed this information while calculating its impact on her strategic planning. The initiative's success had been based on superior human technology and organization overwhelming entities that relied primarily on animal cunning and natural abilities. If that assumption was incorrect, everything would need to be re-evaluated. How advanced? Margaret asked. Difficult to assess without more samples, but these tools show metallurgy and engineering that's at least equivalent to early human industrial capabilities. Dr. Patterson paused, consulting her notes. There's something else. Analysis of biological samples suggests the entities aren't a naturally occurring species. Margaret felt ice in her veins. What do you mean? I mean, they show evidence of deliberate modification, enhanced musculature, improved sensory capabilities, brain structures that appear to have been altered to support higher cognitive functions. Dr. Patterson looked directly at Margaret. Someone or something created these entities as weapons against human settlement. The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow. If Dr. Patterson was correct, the Oregon crisis wasn't just about territorial competition between species. It was about a deliberate campaign of warfare being conducted by an intelligence that remained completely hidden. Any indication of who might be responsible? Margaret asked. Dr. Patterson shook her head. The modification techniques are beyond anything in current scientific literature. Whoever created these entities has capabilities that exceed known human technological development. Margaret left the research facility with her mind racing through strategic implications that challenged everything she thought she understood about their situation. If the entities were created weapons rather than naturally evolved opponents, the initiative might be fighting a limited engagement in a much larger conflict. She found Daniel waiting in her office, his weathered face showing the kind of concern that had become familiar during their most challenging operations. The partnership that had begun with his rescue of her from a Boer siege had evolved into a professional collaboration that combined his frontier expertise with her strategic and administrative capabilities. "Elena briefed you on the tool analysis?" Daniel asked without preamble. Margaret nodded, settling behind the desk that had become the command center for territorial defense operations. "What's your assessment of the tactical situation?" Daniel spread a map across her desk, marking locations where his teams had encountered entities over the past month. They're withdrawing from direct confrontation, but they're not retreating. They're repositioning for something different. Margaret studied the pattern of encounters, recognizing a strategic shift that confirmed her worst suspicions. "They're preparing for escalation. That's my reading," Daniel confirmed. "Question is whether we're ready for whatever they're planning to throw at us next." Margaret looked out her office window at Fort Cascade, at the training exercises, research facilities, and communication networks that represented humanity's best effort to establish secure settlement in Oregon territory. A year ago, she had been a desperate woman seeking security through marriage to a stranger. Now she was responsible for defending human civilization against enemies that challenged fundamental assumptions about the natural world. "We'll be ready," she said, with the confidence that had carried her through months of impossible challenges. "We've built something here that can adapt to whatever they can create." Daniel smiled with the expression she had learned to recognize as approval from someone who didn't give praise lightly. "You've come a long way from that scared woman barricaded." In Thomas Hartwell's cabin, Margaret returned his smile, thinking about the journey that had transformed her from a mail-order bride into the architect of territorial defense strategy. "I had excellent teachers and compelling motivation to learn quickly." As evening settled over Fort Cascade, Margaret stood once again on the observation platform, watching the lights of secure settlements scattered across the valley below. Each light represented families who could sleep safely because of the defensive networks she had designed and implemented. The woman who had answered Samuel Morrison's advertisement seeking a refined lady for matrimony was gone, replaced by someone who had created her own definition of what a refined lady could accomplish on the frontier. She had found partnership, purpose, and the kind of meaningful work that her father had always insisted she was capable of achieving. The challenges ahead would test everything she had learned about leadership, strategy, and survival in hostile territory. But Margaret Thornfield, no longer seeking someone else's protection, no longer dependent on others' promises, was ready for whatever the frontier might demand of her. She had built something unprecedented, a new kind of frontier, institution that combined military capability, scientific research, and the hard-won wisdom of those who had learned to thrive in circumstances that would have destroyed conventional settlements. The mail-order bride had become the architect of humanity's future in Oregon territory, and she had done it entirely on her own terms. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.